Okay, so this is not a typical video you will find on my channel. I'm not the guy who always wants to riff on bad media. I prefer to talk in depth about stuff I actually like. But in the case of American Horror Stories, I just had to talk about this, whatever the hell this is. So how to even start with this mess? The idea of a spin-off of American Horror Story is brilliant. You have so much more freedom than with your typical season of the show, but what they actually made is at best okay and at worst bafflingly bad and confusing. Like the last episode of this first season has to be one of the most idiotic things I have ever seen a show do, and I just can't wrap my head around it. Before I start the video, subscribing and liking and commenting this video would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Now, before I tell you why I do not enjoy American Horror Stories, let me explain why I love the original series American Horror Story so much. I discovered AHS with its first season in 2011, which was a time where the golden age of television had just started, with gems like Dexter, Breaking Bad, Walking Dead, and many more shows that were basically long movies with excellent storytelling and cinematography. I'm a huge horror fan, and American Horror Story perfectly scratched that horror itch by delivering bonkers, messy, and over-the-top plotlines, telling one story per season but also connecting characters and locations throughout different seasons, plus remixing and smashing together different horror subgenres. The second season is my favorite one, combining different horror tropes like a slasher villain, crazy doctors in an evil asylum, and even aliens? That to me, with the crazy editing and unusual style of camera movement and sound design, made the series so great. Now, before I start to shit on the newly released spin-off series American Horror Stories, I want to be fair at first. 1. The idea of a spin-off where every episode is different, a la The Twilight Zone, can easily work with the style and tone of American Horror Story. 2. I think AHS last season 1984 already had massive issues, since to me the series worked best when it combined different genres, and that season was just a boring sentimental 80s slasher flick with no big plot twists or creativity thrown in, so it's not like the original series is perfect either. And 3, while I think that this spin-off series was pretty awful, there are at least 2 or 3 episodes that I consider to be pretty good. But since the rest of the series was so bad, I am not even sure if I just like these episodes because they were not so bad like the others. The problems with American Horror Stories already start at the beginning of the season with this two-parter set in the murder house of the first season. Man, I was very comfortable with the actual ending we got to the whole murder house storyline in the Apocalypse season, so revisiting the murder house to me was already a kind of bad idea, but hey, I wanted to be open to this, but sadly, this revisit does not deliver. What got me confused from the first seconds of the show was the look. Now, it does make sense to change up some aspects of your visual identity when you make a spin-off, because you don't want to just imitate the original series, but the way that American Horror Stories is shot and edited is just so bland and uninspiring. It just looks too clean and digital. There is no real creativity in the visual presentation, and it just looks like the typical Netflix production shot on digital cameras. Let's briefly talk about the story of the 2 episodes, because I have a lot of stories to cover, and honestly, all of them lack so much depth and creativity, there really isn't too much to say. Well, besides the last one, where I'm probably going to rant like a maniac. In the first 2 episodes, called Rubberman 1 and 2, we follow the teenage girl Scarlett and her parents moving into the murder house, where she finds the costume of the Rubberman from the first season. She definitely has some kinky, perverted fantasies of her own and a little bit of darkness in her, and when she puts on the costume, she starts living out those fantasies. Now, the biggest problem here is that we have already seen so many characters going going to the murder house, and we know the basic gist of how the house works. People getting killed by ghosts and having to stay there for all eternity. In these 2 episodes, there is a weird focus on a teenage romance between Scarlett and a ghost girl, and I think my biggest criticism here is that besides the lack of any creativity, horror and surprises, the show really feels like a teenage version of American Horror Story, which is sadly a problem that runs through all of these episodes. They are very kitschy, romantic and oversimplified, or well, we are going to get to you soon, buddy. I didn't really feel for any characters or care what was going on, and the tone of these episodes just felt wrong. What came to my mind while watching them was, hey, it's American Horror Story written by the Riverdale writers. This one is just alright. It's not great, but it's very gory and entertaining in that sense, while also being just as bland and predictable like the first 2 episodes. Drive-In tells the story of an infamous horror movie that drives audiences crazy and bloodthirsty, that comes to a small town, leaving a group of teenagers in a drive-in nightmare. As I said, this episode is fine. There really isn't too much to say. I think like the first 2 episodes, there is nothing you can really take away from it that we have not seen in any other horror show or movie, so yay to mediocre storytelling. The gore is kind of fun though, and there is also a CGI fire at the end that is hilariously bad. And we are tipping into the really bad territory now. Naughty-List is about a group of influencers slash vloggers who piss off a murderous Santa Claus that punishes them for their sins. Yeah. That plot synopsis alone should just tell you anything that you need to know. The whole influencers are bad angle just screams okay boomer meme, and the Santa Claus story part that features Danny Trejo aka Machete, which could have been such an amazing concept because of the badass actor portraying the character, almost feels like an afterthought and is so brief that it just blows my mind. This whole episode is so focused on these terrible prick influencer characters that are unlikable that it just feels like torturing yourself. If you are a masochist, I highly recommend Naughty-List, but if you are just an average person, stay the hell away from this cringe fest. Baal, I think I'm pronouncing this right, is actually pretty damn good. Now, one aspect that I have not even touched on is the horror aspect in this show, and until episode 5, all of these stories were not scary at all. But there are some creepy moments in episode 5. To make my statement as brief as possible, this one is about a couple who wants to desperately get a baby, and the wife, Liv, played by the brilliant Billie Lourd, does something a little bit unusual to get the pregnancy going. What can I say? This is exactly what I wanted out of this show. Creepy, creative stories with some clever plot twists and a satisfying conclusion. Sure, it won't win any awards, but Baal actually works as a cool horror story. My only gripe, the last like 10 seconds are a bit questionable considering what we have seen beforehand, but I'm going to let that slide. Feral is about a family that goes on a camping trip, and honestly, just like episode 3, there's so little to talk about in terms of creativity or good acting or something else. It's just a bland camping horror trip where the son goes missing and the parents try their best to find him again. The ending is kind of cool, but it feels like another filler episode and not something I have even the power to talk about right now. Sorry. Okay, here it is, the big one, the finale. This finale, which is called Game Over, which, yep, is unironically what happened to me when I watched this piece of garbage, is Well, it tries to be meta like the Scream series, and okay, I have tried to be as spoiler free as possible until now, but I need to spoil this whole thing, which honestly should not be a big problem for most people because this shit show is not even worth the watch. But from now on, a big spoiler warning, I guess. So we start our episode by introducing a new couple that moves in, you guessed it, into the murder house. They are horror fans that watch American Horror Story and want to visit the house from the show, which has allegedly turned into like a fun theme park attraction, scary house thing. Number 1, the murder house again? Really? Number 2, so American Horror Story meticulously built this whole lore with connected stories and characters running through the decades, but now they turn this whole thing around and revealed that this is just a show. Okay, sometimes I like meta storytelling, but in the case of AHS, it just feels wrong, at least to me. I can't even put my finger on it, but it doesn't really suit the overall feeling that I got of the series as a whole, but alright. Let's be fair and pretend like this is canon, okay? Well, the show immediately makes everything very, very complicated. So first of all, the couple meets a lot of characters from previous seasons, believing them to be just actors of a haunted house attraction, including some characters from the first episode of this series, American Horror Stories. So what you are trying to say is that in this universe, there is American Horror Story and American Horror Stories, right? So it directly acknowledges that the first episode is also fake. But then it actually turns out that the couple that are in this house are playable characters of a video game that is based on the show, and the lady that develops this game has never really watched the show based on direction of her son that gives her advice on how to make the game better. But how the hell did she even have so much knowledge of the show without having even really watched it that much? And how does a game look as realistic as a TV show? And why am I watching this crap again? Okay, but it gets even better, or I guess worse, guys. So the lady then moves into the murder house that also exists in her universe, but there's also ghosts, including again characters from the first season and the first episode of the spin-off, and she gets killed and then gets forgotten by the writers so they can just continue with the plot of the first episode with Scarlett and her girlfriend, and it turns into this sentimental crap where I just feel numb because all of this doesn't make any sense. But then plot twist, it was also just a game, but it is the game that the mother made that her son actually likes now. So basically implying that the first episode of American Horror Stories was also just a video game, and then they add another layer of shitty meta storytelling by revealing that some of the ghosts of that game or reality or whatever now live in the house of the family because they burned down the murder house in the game? Or what the hell is going on? Look, when I said I was bummed about the lack of creativity, I didn't mean that they should just take LSD and destroy their own lore and the fundamentals of American Horror Story by adding a shit ton of meta bullshit that doesn't make any sense. And besides that, it's not entertaining. I mean, you can make an episode like this, maybe with better writing, but then it also needs to be, you know, fun, entertaining and engaging and maybe a little bit scary and make some kind of sense. Ah, gosh, I feel bad for shitting so much on this property, but man, this was a painful experience for me. I am a huge fan of the original series, so I was hoping that this would be kind of like that, but what I got was watered down AHS with Riverdale writing catered to a teenage audience shenanigans and some truly baffling choices, especially in the finale. So yeah, good news though, I just finished watching the first 2 episodes of the new AHS season 10. And they are extremely cool. And I hope that this season, which is called Double Feature, will wash out the bad taste that is still in my mouth due to this shitty spin-off. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell if you want to see more videos. Until next time, stay pulpy and stay artsy. See ya!